It begins in the dark, a low, persistent hum, the sound of air being conditioned to hold back time. Then a single source of light, carefully aimed, reveals an object. It is not large. 4 sides of baked clay, rising to a gentle point, covered in rows of tiny wedge-shaped marks. It rests on a simple mount inside a glass case. This is the Weld-Blundell prism. It feels less like a royal artifact and more like a piece of administrative hardware, a data storage device from a world that has dissolved back into the dust from which it was made. Its purpose was to hold a memory, to make a sequence permanent. But the memory it holds is not a simple one. It is heavier than the clay, older than the city that buried it. It is a quiet weight in the stillness of this room, a testament to an order that has long since passed from the earth. The silence around it is not empty. It is the space left behind by a forgotten thought. We move closer, the light catching the texture of the clay, the faint imperfections of its surface. The marks are cuneiform, one of the first true scripts. They were not carved, but pressed into the wet clay with the edge of a reed stylus. You can almost feel the presence of the hand that made them, the steady, deliberate pressure required for each character. This was not the work of a poet, celebrating the deeds of a hero. This is the work of an administrator, a scribe. The script is uniform, disciplined, repetitive. It has the cold rhythm of an inventory, the dispassionate structure of a legal code. It was designed for clarity, for permanence. It was a technology for recording facts. The number of sheep in a temple's flock, the weight of silver paid in a transaction, the transfer of a title. The hand that wrote this was concerned with data, not with drama. Its function was to record, to catalog, to ensure the official version of events was preserved against the erosion of memory and the whisper of competing claims. The narrator's voice is low, measured, as if not to disturb the dust. It translates a section from near the middle of the list. In Kish and Mebarajesi, the one who carried away as spoil the weapons of the land of Elam became king. He ruled for 900 years. The name is familiar to historians, and Mebarajesi is a known figure, his existence corroborated by other fragments, other inscriptions found in the ruins. He is a king who stands on the threshold of our own history, a figure anchored, however loosely, in a recognizable world. The number, 900 years, is vast, a king's life stretched into the shape of a myth, but it is a myth of a type we understand, a familiar exaggeration of power and longevity. It is a number that, while incredible, still belongs to a human scale of storytelling. It allows the document to feel, for a moment, like a history we can almost grasp, a genealogy of kings reaching back from a known point into a legendary, but still conceivable, past. But the scribe did not begin his record there. The eye is drawn upward, back to the beginning of the text, to the very first lines impressed at the top of the prism. The formatting is identical, the same dispassionate administrative tone, the same systematic cataloging of names, locations, and durations. Yet, the preamble sets a different stage. It does not begin with a man or a city, but with a concept. The scribe writes, with perfect bureaucratic clarity, "After the kingship descended from heaven." The statement is presented as a procedural fact, the opening entry in a long and complex ledger. Kingship is not a right earned by conquest or a system developed by human ingenuity. It is an institution, a principle of order that arrived from elsewhere, fully formed. It is a technology of governance, delivered to the world. This is the document's own stated origin, the starting point of the entire record that follows. Then comes the first entry, following this cosmic transfer, the data point that quietly breaks the world. The text continues, without any change in tone or structure. The kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 800 years. The number is delivered with the same factual sobriety as the 900 years of Enmebarajesi. It is not presented as a metaphor. It is not framed by poetic language. It is an administrative entry, 28,800 years. The number sits there on the clay, a perfect set of wedges, a piece of data that does not fit the container. The scribe offers no explanation. He simply records the term of office and moves to the next entry. The sheer scale of the number, presented so calmly, creates a silent rupture in the fabric of the record. It is a mathematical impossibility recorded as a historical fact. The hum of the archive seems to deepen, the air growing stiller around this single inexplicable piece of information. Here lies the central, disturbing contradiction of the object. We are looking at a product of the early Bronze Age, a civilization we understand through its material remains. These were people of profound practicality. They developed mathematics for surveying land and tracking celestial bodies for agriculture. They engineered canals to irrigate their fields. They built cities of mud brick and established complex trade networks. Their writing, this very cuneiform, was invented for the most pragmatic of purposes: accounting. Why would a culture so grounded in the realities of harvest cycles, trade deficits, and territorial disputes dedicate its most permanent form of record-keeping to a sequence of information so utterly detached from any lived reality? It is as if a modern spreadsheet, meticulously formatted, began with a line item accounting for a transaction that occurred 1,000,000 years before the company was founded. The medium and the message are in direct conflict. The anomaly is not isolated. It is the beginning of a pattern. The scribe continues his work, listing the successor to Alulim. Alalngar ruled for 36 Awasuaro years. Again, the number is precise. It is not a vague, for a very long time. It is a specific quantity, recorded with care. The first two kings of the first city ruled for a combined total of 64,800 years. As the list progresses, through other pre-diluvial cities, this pattern of vast, specific, and mathematically structured reigns continues. The numbers are often multiples of 60, or multiples of a larger unit known as a SAR, equal to 3,600. This is not the random, chaotic storytelling of mythology. This is a system. It is a carefully structured dataset that follows its own internal, mathematical logic. The scribe was not inventing fanciful tales. He was transcribing a pre-existing, standardized record, one whose terms of reference operated on a timescale that is, to us, geological rather than historical. The document then records another procedural step, one that deepens the sense of an alien administrative logic. After the reigns of its first two kings, the city of Eridu does not fall in battle, nor is it abandoned. The text states simply, "Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira." The institution of power itself is mobile. Kingship is treated as a singular, tangible object, a seat of authority that can be formally relocated from one city's archives to another's. This is not the story of a rising and falling dynasty. It is the documented transfer of a governing franchise. The narrative is not concerned with the lives of these kings, their wars, or their families. It is concerned only with the location of this abstract principle of order and the official duration of its stay in each designated capital. The entire pre-diluvial section reads like the minutes of a cosmic board meeting, tracking the formal assignment of a celestial charter across the surface of the earth. Pulling back from the object, we see it for what it is: a quiet, profound enigma. It is a piece of accounting from another reality. Myths are stories that explain the world through the actions of gods and heroes. They provide a moral or cosmological framework. This list does none of that. It is devoid of narrative color, of divine intervention, of human struggle. It is a sterile, sequential list of names, places, and numbers. It is an index to an archive that no longer exists, a table of contents for a library that has been erased. The question it forces upon us is not whether these kings truly lived for 30,000 years. The question is why a civilization of builders, farmers, and accountants insisted, across multiple copies and over centuries, on preserving this exact sequence of impossible data as the formal foundational chapter of their entire history. What memory were they protecting? The light on the prism seems to soften. The hum of the climate control fades into a deeper silence. We are left alone with the object and the question it refuses to answer. It is a message in a bottle, a coherent piece of information sent across an ocean of time so vast that the world from which it was sent is no longer on any of our maps. It demands not a quick explanation, but a slow, patient observation. There are certain artifacts that do not ask for interpretation, but for witness, and for those who have chosen to remain here, in the quiet of this room, a different kind of listening has already begun. The silence itself is becoming the evidence. The work of the scribe was not a singular act of creation, it was an act of transmission. In the quiet archives of museums from London to Philadelphia, other fragments of this same list lie under glass, or wait in climate-controlled drawers. Some are older, some are from different cities, unearthed from the layered ruins of Kish, Susa, or Nippur. They are not identical, showing minor variations like any document copied by hand over centuries, but their core structure, the foundational data of that first epoch, remains stubbornly consistent. The same sequence of cities, the same names of kings, and the same impossible numbers appear again and again. What we are witnessing is not the work of one imaginative poet, but the careful preservation of a standardized official record. The scribe was not an author, he was a custodian of data. This repetition transforms the artifact from an anomaly into a system. A single prism could be dismissed as a flight of fancy, a local ruler's attempt to craft a grandiose lineage. But multiple copies, found across the breadth of ancient Mesopotamia, point to something else entirely. They suggest a shared, foundational text, a piece of information considered so vital that it was painstakingly duplicated and distributed among the great administrative centers of the land. It was a document of state, a charter that every major city needed to possess a copy of. The question then shifts. We are no longer asking why one scribe wrote this, but why generations of scribes, across hundreds of years and hundreds of miles, were all tasked with preserving the exact same impossible history. The air in these archival rooms is heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Each clay tablet, with its neat columns of cuneiform, is a testament to a thought process we can no longer access. They were stored alongside practical records, inventories of livestock, astronomical observations for planting seasons, legal codes governing property and debt. They were part of the machinery of a functioning, pragmatic civilization. Yet this one document speaks a different language, a language of time stretched to a geological scale. The silence surrounding these objects is the sound of a profound conceptual disconnect. We are looking at the hardware of a lost civilization, and we have the data, but we seem to be missing the operating system required to make any sense of it. Let us return to the beginning of the record, to the first city, Eridu. The scribe notes the reign of Alulim, 800 years. This is stated as an administrative fact. The number is not an approximation. It is a precise quantity. 8 sars. In the Sumerian sexagesimal system, with a sar being a unit of 600. The scribe follows this with the reign of Alalangar, 36,000 years, 10 sars. The precision is unnerving. It suggests a system of accounting, not of storytelling. Myths speak of countless ages, or the time of the ancestors. An administrative ledger records specific, quantifiable terms of office. The scribe is performing an act of accounting for a period of time so vast that it sits outside the bounds of human history, yet he does so with the dispassionate accuracy of a clerk, noting the contents of a warehouse. The record continues its cold, procedural march. After a combined reign of 800 years, the text notes the transfer of power. Then Eridu fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tibira. There, the scribe lists 3 more kings. Enmen-Luana, who ruled for 200 years. That is 12 Sars. Then Enmen-Gal-Ana, for 800 years, another 8 Sars. And finally, Dumuzid, the shepherd, whose term is recorded as 36 Eswaro years, a further 10 Sars. The pattern is relentless. The names change. The locations are formally updated, but the underlying structure of the data remains the same. A sequence of impossibly large, mathematically structured numbers, each one recorded with bureaucratic finality, before the scribe moves to the next entry in the ledger. There is no emotion, no narrative, only the transfer of a title and the closing of an account. It becomes clear that we are not reading a story. We are auditing a database. The numbers are not arbitrary exaggerations. They follow a deliberate, internal logic. The frequent appearance of the 600-year SAR unit, the base 60 mathematical structure, suggests a calculated system. This is not the wild, organic growth of legend. It is the product of a mind, or a tradition, that thought mathematically about deep time. The scribe was not inventing these figures. He was transcribing them from an earlier source, a source that was itself structured and systematic. We are looking at the output of a formula, a temporal map whose key has been lost. The document's strangeness is not in its fantasy, but in its cold, alien rationality. The kingship is transferred again. Then Bad Tibira fell, and the kingship was taken to Larak. Here, the list records only one king, Ensipad-Zid-Ana. His reign is given as 800 years, 8 Sars. The entry is as brief and formal as all the others. A single ruler, a single vast period of time, and then the account for that city is closed. The text treats cities not as organic communities, but as temporary headquarters, designated holding locations for the institution of kingship. They are stations in a grand, continental relay. The narrative has no interest in the fate of Larak or its people after its function is complete. The only thing that matters is where the kingship went next. We must pause here. The recitation of these names and numbers can begin to feel like an incantation, a litany from a forgotten ritual. The sheer scale of the timeline being laid out pushes against the limits of our historical imagination. Standing in the silent desert where Larak once stood, there is nothing but wind and sand. The layers of earth beneath your feet might hold a few thousand years of human settlement. The scribe, however, speaks of a single reign that lasted longer than the entire recorded history of civilization, from the building of the first pyramids to the present day. The physical world of archaeology and the textual world of the king list seem to exist in 2 different, irreconcilable dimensions of time. The methodical sequence resumes. The next entry is for the city of Sipar. Again, a single king is named, Enmen-Dur-Ana. His term of office is recorded as 21 Ziozuo years. The number is different, not a clean multiple of a Seari, yet it is delivered with the same administrative certainty. Each entry adds another layer to the structure, another piece of data that reinforces the pattern of a systematic, yet incomprehensible, record. The scribe's stylus moves on, pressing the wedge-shaped marks into the clay, his task being the faithful reproduction of the list, not its interpretation. He is a conduit for a memory that was already ancient in his own time. For a moment, become aware of the specific time on the clock where you are now. Note the quality of the light in the room, the ambient sound, the feeling of the air. The scribe who recorded the 2100-year reign in Sipar also worked within a single, fleeting moment, under a specific sky that has long since vanished. He made a mark in clay to hold a piece of the past. If you feel inclined, you might make a small mark of your own in the space below this narrative. A record of the hour, The place, a simple coordinate in time, a quiet signal to show that you were here, listening across the millennia to this cold, strange report. The list then designates the final city of this epoch, Shurupak. The king named is Ubaratutu. His reign is listed as 18,600 years. This is the last king before the great rupture in the text. In other Mesopotamian traditions, Ubaratutu is known as the father of Ziusudra, the man who survives the Great Flood. But in this document, he is given no such narrative weight. He is simply the final administrator in a long line of predecessors, the last data point before the system undergoes a catastrophic reset. His entry is recorded with the same dispassionate finality as all the others. The scribe offers no foreshadowing, no dramatic pause. He is simply closing the books on an era. The sum of these reigns is a number that defies comprehension. 8 kings across 5 cities. The scribe's own tally, noted on some versions of the list, records a total of 241 years, nearly 250,000 years of continuous institutional rule. This figure is presented not as a mythic age, but as the calculated sum of a series of official terms. It is the grand total at the bottom of a cosmic ledger. The camera might focus on the block of cuneiform wedges that represent this number, a single piece of data that contains more time than our species has had cities. It is a mathematical statement about a past that our own science tells us is impossible. This structure is fundamentally different from a royal genealogy. The purpose of a king list in the ancient world was typically to establish legitimacy for the current ruler, tracing his lineage back to a powerful or divine ancestor. This list, however, seems less concerned with bloodlines than with an abstract principle. Its protagonist is not a man or a dynasty, but the institution of kingship itself. The document's purpose appears to be to prove that this principle of ordered governance has existed as an unbroken chain, a continuous terrestrial franchise handed down from a heavenly origin, for an immense period of time before the world as we know it began. It is a record of institutional durability, not human succession. The true weight of this document becomes apparent when it is seen in its original context. Imagine it in the clay tablet archives of a Sumerian temple. It sits on a shelf next to other records, written in the same script by the same scribal class. One tablet is a receipt for a shipment of barley. Another is a legal contract detailing the sale of a field. A third is a list of omens derived from the liver of a sacrificial sheep. These are the documents of a grounded, pragmatic people, concerned with the tangible realities of agriculture, commerce, and religion. Their world is one of mud brick, irrigation canals, and the precise cycles of the moon and stars. And yet, among these records of the mundane world sits this other list, a file containing a 250,000-year history of a lost epoch. The scribe who catalogued the temple's grain stores may have been the same one who copied the reign of Alulim. For the Sumerian administrator, there was no contradiction. The pre-diluvial reigns were not a separate category of information called myth. They were part of the state archives. They were foundational data. The existence of kingship for 200 years, was an administrative fact of the same order as the fact that a particular farmer owed the temple 30 bushels of wheat. The impossible was filed right next to the ordinary. We are left in a silent storeroom surrounded by these fragments of a worldview we can no longer inhabit. Each tablet is a piece of a vast, interlocking puzzle, but the picture on the box is gone. The silence in this room is not merely an absence of noise, it is an absence of context. We can translate the words, we can read the numbers, but we have lost the framework of understanding in which a 800-year reign was considered a piece of recordable information. We are like archaeologists who have found a perfect, intricate gear, but the machine to which it once belonged has been completely obliterated. Looking closer at the clay, you can see the faint impressions left by the scribe's hand, the subtle changes in pressure as he formed each wedge. This was a physical act, a human being performing a meticulous, repetitive task. He was not an inventor of tales. He was a civil servant, a data clerk in a long chain of transmission. His primary duty was not to create, but to preserve the integrity of the record. He copied what was on the tablet before him, ensuring that the official history, the authorized version of the deep past, was carried forward without corruption into the future. He was a human bridge across time, passing along a file that was already ancient. This very consistency across so many surviving copies, unearthed from the ruins of different cities, implies a common ancestor. All these lists must derive from a single, much older source document, a master record that was considered the definitive authority. That original tablet, perhaps written on a more perishable medium, or perhaps simply lost to the violence of time, is gone. The prisms and tablets we now hold are merely backups, echoes of a primary account from an even more remote period. The real document is the missing one, and the mystery deepens. It is no longer just a question of what these incredible numbers mean, but from where and from whom the very first scribe received this impossible file. The silence of the archive is a specific kind of silence. It is not empty. It is filled with the weight of records waiting to be read. We leave the dust of Mesopotamia for a moment and travel west, across desert and sea, to the banks of another great river, the Nile. Here, in the equally quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the Museo Egizio in Turin, lies another document, far more fragile than the Sumerian clay. It is a papyrus, shattered by time into more than 160 fragments. What remains of it is a testament to the patient work of reconstruction, a ghost of a document pieced back together over years of painstaking labor. This is the Turin King List, a record written in hieratic script, the cursive hand of ancient Egyptian scribes, around the time of Ramesses II. It is another civilization's attempt to make its own history permanent. Here, the archaeologist is a conservator, their presence felt in the delicate arrangement of the fragments. We see hands, steady and precise, working under magnification. A single misplaced piece, no larger than a thumbnail, could alter the meaning of a dynasty. The light is low, angled to reveal the faint traces of ink on the brittle fibers of the papyrus. This is not the work of a treasure hunter seeking gold, but of a scholar seeking a sequence, a coherent order from the chaos of time's destruction. Each fragment is a rescued word, a saved number, pulled back from the edge of oblivion. The task is one of immense patience, a slow conversation with a document that has been torn to pieces. It is an act of listening to a voice that has been reduced to a whisper, almost lost in the noise of the intervening 3,000 years. As the fragments are assembled, a familiar structure begins to emerge from the wreckage. The list is methodical, administrative. It records the names of pharaohs, followed by the precise length of their reigns, down to the number of months and days. It is a document of state, a tool of bureaucracy. It accounts for the historical dynasties we know, the builders of the Great Pyramids, and the temples of Karnak. But like the Sumerian list, it does not begin there. The scribe of the Turin Papyrus began his official history in a much deeper, stranger place. The first sections of the list, painstakingly reassembled, catalog the reigns of the gods: Ptah, Ra, Geb, Osiris, Seth, Horus. They are not presented as mythological figures in a story, but as the first kings of the land, each with a specific recorded term of office. The pattern, once seen, is impossible to ignore. Two of the world's most ancient and influential civilizations, Sumer and Egypt, though separated by 1,000 miles of desert and 1,000 years of development, both chose to begin their official, state-sanctioned histories in the same way. They anchor their timelines not in the deeds of the first human ruler, but in a preceding epoch of immense duration, an era when the principle of kingship was held by entities that were not human. This is not a simple creation myth. This is a recurring feature of official historiography. It is a structural signature, a shared method for organizing the deep past. The implication is unsettling, that for the most ancient record keepers, history did not begin with humanity. Humanity was a late chapter in a much older, already established story. The air in these archives begins to feel different. The silence connecting these disparate records is no longer empty. It becomes a resonant space, a field of inquiry for those who have the patience to remain. Recognizing this pattern is not a sudden revelation. It is the result of a slow, steady gaze, a willingness to sit with the evidence long after the initial novelty has faded. For those who continue this vigil, a quiet community forms across time and space. You are not the first to notice this echo. To see the pattern is to join a long line of observers, stretching back to the very scribes who first felt the strangeness of the data they were charged to preserve. It suggests that the past is not a closed book, but an ongoing investigation, and you have become a part of it simply by staying here. The Turin Papyrus is not a lone voice from the Nile. Its strange chronology is confirmed by another, later source. Around 300 BCE, an Egyptian priest named Manetho, living in the new Greek-ruled world of the Ptolemies, was commissioned to write a complete history of his country. He had access to temple libraries and ancient records, many of which are now lost to us forever. His work, the Egyptiaca, survives only in fragments quoted by later historians, but the framework is clear. Manetho, the careful archivist, also divides Egyptian history into ages. He begins with a long period when gods ruled, followed by a secondary era of demigods, or heroes, and a third age of spirits of the dead. Only after these three long, pre-human epochs does he begin his accounting of the first mortal pharaoh, Menes. Manetho's numbers are as staggering as those from Sumer. He assigns specific reigns to these divine rulers, calculating a total duration that stretches back tens of thousands of years. According to one summary of his work, the reign of the gods alone lasted for 13,900 years. The subsequent ages of demigods and spirits add thousands more. Like his anonymous predecessors in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, Manetho presents this information not as a poetic prologue, but as a chronological fact. He was a priest and a historian, working to create a definitive official record. For him and for the tradition he was documenting, this deep, non-human past was not myth. It was period one. It was the necessary, foundational data required to make sense of everything that came after. We must consider the function of these men. The Sumerian scribe, the compiler of the Turin Papyrus, the priest Manetho, they were not entertainers. They were the keepers of the official flame, the guardians of institutional memory. Their task was to compile and preserve the authorized timeline of their civilization, a record that could be used to legitimize rulers, settle disputes, and maintain the continuity of the state. They were embedded in cultures of profound pragmatism, cultures that invented geometry to resurvey fields after the annual flood, and charted the stars to manage a complex agricultural calendar. Why would these deeply practical administrative systems all insist on preserving a foundational chapter that so completely defies practical human reality? The pattern is not one of fantasy, but of a shared, inexplicable bureaucratic procedure. The echo now returns to Mesopotamia, but in a later age. In the 3rd century BCE, at the same time Manetho was compiling his history of Egypt, a Babylonian priest named Berossus was writing a history of his own land for the new Greek rulers of the Seleucid Empire. Berossus was a scholar of the old ways, a man who could still read the ancient cuneiform tablets stored in the temple archives of Babylon. He had access to the direct lineage of Sumerian and Akkadian knowledge. His work, like Manetho's, is mostly lost, surviving only in quotations, but what survives is startling. Berossus, drawing from his temple records, also presents a history that begins with a list of kings who ruled before a great, world-altering flood. The structure is chillingly familiar. Berossus lists 10 kings, starting with a figure named Alaros, who ruled for 36 Wazran years. The parallels to the Sumerian king list are undeniable. Aloros is the Hellenized name for Alulim, the first king of Eridu. The sequence of 10 rulers, the impossibly vast reigns, the catastrophic flood that ends the epoch. It is the same narrative skeleton, the same data structure, preserved for nearly 2,000 years, and translated into a new language for a new empire. Berossus even provides a grand total for the reigns of these 10 kings, a period of 432,000 years. This is not a random number. It is exactly 120 SARS, the Sumerian unit of 600 years. The mathematical system, the administrative logic, had survived intact. Imagine a scholar in the great library of Alexandria, a place where the knowledge of the world was gathered under one roof. He has a copy of Manetho's newly completed History of Egypt on his left. On his right, a scroll containing the work of Berossus on the history of Babylon has just arrived. He reads them both. He is perhaps the first person in 2 millennia to see the two traditions side by side. He sees the reigns of the gods and the demigods in the Egyptian account. He sees the 10 pre-diluvial kings with their enormous reigns in the Babylonian one. He sees the same deep structure, the same insistence on a lost epoch of non-human rule, presented as historical fact by the most learned priests of the world's 2 oldest civilizations. What must he have thought, sitting there in the quiet of the library, as he became the first node in a pattern of recognition that we are only now rediscovering? The work of the archaeologist provides the physical anchor for this textual pattern. We move to a dig site in the Iraqi desert, the mound that marks the location of ancient Shuruppak. A researcher kneels in a trench, the sun low in the sky. The layers of soil are visible in the trench wall, a clear stratigraphy of time. Each layer of compacted earth, each change in color from brown to gray, represents a period of occupation, abandonment, and rebuilding. The city is a physical stack of memories. With a small brush, the researcher clears dust from a dark shape embedded in the soil. It is a clay tablet, broken but still bearing the marks of a scribe's stylus. It is another fragment of the story, pulled from the earth where it was buried thousands of years ago. This act of recovery is slow and uncertain. For every complete prism found safely in the foundations of a temple, there are 1,000 shattered fragments scattered in the ruins of a collapsed archive. The historical record we possess is not a complete library. It is a collection of pages torn from their books and scattered by a storm. The work of the researcher is to find these pages, one by one, and to see if they can be pieced back together. They compare the new fragment with known texts, looking for a familiar name, a repeated phrase, a sequence of numbers that matches the established pattern. It is a search for echoes, for the faint signal of a coherent message amid the static of millennia. The pattern we are observing, then, is not one of myth-making. It is not the simple diffusion of a popular story from one culture to another. The tone is wrong. The structure is too cold, too administrative. It feels less like storytelling and more like a shared technical standard. It is as if the foundational civilizations of the Fertile Crescent and even the Nile Valley were all operating from a common procedural template for how official history was to be formatted. A template that demanded, as its first and most important step, the acknowledgement of a vast, pre-human timescale, an epoch of order that existed before our own world began. The consistency of this template across cultures and centuries is the central, unnerving fact. The implications of this are profound. We are not dealing with isolated curiosities. We are looking at the remnants of a system for recording time and power that was once the standard model for the ancient world, but whose operational logic is now lost to us. The Sumerian king list is not a strange, one-off anomaly from a single culture. It is the most complete surviving copy of a foundational document, a master timeline, whose basic structure was known and replicated from the plains of Shinar to the temples of Memphis. The document was considered so fundamental that its core data, the sequence of pre-human rulers and the Great Rupture, was preserved even as the empires that housed it rose and fell. In the low light of museum displays, these artifacts rest in their climate-controlled cases. The Weld Blundell prism, a fragment of the Turin papyrus, a page from a medieval manuscript quoting Berossus. They are from different worlds, written in different scripts, on different materials. One is clay, solid and heavy. One is papyrus, light and fragile. One is parchment, the skin of an animal. They are separated by geography, by language, by millennia. Yet they all point back to the same impossible memory. They are independent witnesses testifying to the same strange event, the same lost chapter in the planet's history. They are pieces of a map whose territory has vanished. The physical presence of the researcher in the field reminds us that this is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a material one. Each fragment was once held in a human hand. Each layer of earth that is scraped away represents a real passage of time. The pattern is not an abstraction. It is encoded in baked clay and dried ink, buried under the dust of forgotten cities. The archaeologist's trowel scrapes against something hard. The conservator's tweezers lift a fragile piece of papyrus. The historian's eyes scan a faded line of text. All of them are engaged in the same act, reaching back across an immense darkness to touch the edges of a coherent and profoundly strange piece of information. The scope of our investigation has now widened. The question is no longer confined to a single prism from Sumer. The anomaly is systemic. A signal is repeating from multiple, independent sources in the deep past. It is the ghost of a consensus, a shared memory among the ancestors of our civilization. They all agreed on the basic shape of history, that ours was not the first. The task is no longer to explain a single document, but to account for a pattern that is woven into the very foundations of ancient record-keeping. The hum in the archive is growing louder, composed now of multiple, harmonizing frequencies. The silence is beginning to speak, and it is telling us that the story is far larger than we had imagined. Let us return to the first line of the record, the foundational premise upon which the entire structure is built. After the kingship descended from heaven. The statement is a declaration of origin, a procedural note on the provenance of the system. It presents the entire concept of ordered centralized governance not as a human invention, but as a technology that was imported. It is a prepackaged system, delivered from an external source, ready for implementation. The scribe does not present this as a miracle or an act of divine grace. It is the first entry in a transfer log, a note of receipt for a piece of celestial hardware. The history that follows is not the story of humanity's struggle to create order, but the documented account of its stewardship over a pre-existing non-terrestrial franchise. This concept of a transfer, of a deliberate bringing of knowledge, is not limited to the abstract principle of kingship. Mesopotamian tradition is specific about the details of this handover. It speaks of 7 figures, the Apkallu, who emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf in the time of the first kings. They are not described as conquerors or gods demanding worship. Their function was that of instructors. The records are clear and pragmatic about the content of their curriculum. They brought the foundational software of civilization: writing, law, architecture, agriculture, and the precise knowledge of surveying the land. They are listed as the advisors to the first kings, the technical consultants who oversaw the initial setup of the urban experiment. Their role was purely functional, to install the operating system. We stand on the desolate mound of Eridu, the place where the texts say the first of these sages appeared. The wind moves dust across the shattered pottery and the eroded stumps of mud brick walls. There is nothing here but the silence of a profound absence. Yet beneath this dust lies the memory of a first city, a place where, according to its own foundational records, the very blueprint for its existence was not developed. but delivered. The silence of these ruins is the silence of a classroom after the teachers have departed, leaving only their lessons behind, encoded in the grid-like layout of the streets and the mathematical principles of the first temples. The knowledge is still here, embedded in the ground, but the instructors are gone. The texts do not describe these beings with awe, but with a kind of administrative precision. They are referred to as the pure ones, the wise ones, figures of immense knowledge and capacity, but their interactions are framed as a series of technical support sessions. One sage teaches the construction of temples, another, the principles of irrigation, a third, the intricate patterns of the stars. They are a delegation of experts, each with a specific portfolio, tasked with bringing a pre-literate society up to a new operational standard. The narrative is not about salvation or enlightenment, it is about a technology transfer. The strangeness lies in the cold, dispassionate tone used to describe an event that would, by any measure, be the most significant in human history. This framing forces a profound shift in perspective. If we take the record at its word, then the great leap forward from scattered hunter-gatherer bands to organized urban life was not a slow, organic evolution. It was a managed project. The foundational elements of civilization appear in the archaeological record with a suddenness that has long puzzled historians. Here, in the textual record, the Sumerians themselves provide an explanation. The system was installed. This is not a story of human genius, but of human apprenticeship. It suggests that our civilization is not our own invention, but our inheritance. A legacy system whose original programmers are named, but whose ultimate purpose remains undocumented. The pattern is not confined to the Tigris and Euphrates. We move to the Nile Valley, and to a different set of records. Egyptian traditions speak of a similar transitional period, an age before the first mortal pharaoh, when the land was ruled by the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. These figures are not listed among the great gods, nor are they human. They are a bridge, a lineage of rulers who maintained the order of the divine kingdom, and prepared the way for the establishment of the human dynasties. Manetho's history places them in a distinct epoch, a caretaker administration that governed for millennia after the gods withdrew, and before Men's, the first pharaoh, took the throne. Their function was to manage the handover. The parallel is too structured to be a coincidence. In both Sumer and Egypt, the official state records preserve the memory of an intermediary power, a group of non-human agents who managed the transition into our current historical epoch. They are not chaotic trickster spirits of myth. They are administrators, regents, the keepers of a system during a long programmatic transfer of power. They represent a functional buffer between the divine or otherworldly origin of kingship and its eventual human inheritors. The existence of this parallel memory in two separate foundational civilizations suggests we are not looking at a local myth, but at a shared ancient protocol for how history itself was to be remembered and recorded. The Mesopotamian texts give a name to the larger group from which these instructors and first rulers came, the Anunnaki. This name is not used as a synonym for gods in the modern sense. It appears in the texts as a designation for a collective, a council, a structured hierarchy. The records speak of them with a specificity that is unnerving. They are divided by rank and by domain. The texts mention the 50 great gods, the 7 who decree the fates. They are assigned to specific sectors, some to the heavens, some to the earth, and some to the underworld, or Abzu. This is not the language of mythology. It is the language of a corporate or military org chart, a clear delineation of jurisdictions and responsibilities. Their actions, as recorded, are those of founders and engineers. The texts say they established the first cities, digging the canals, setting the foundations of the temples, and assigning the territories. They are depicted as the original surveyors, the ones who drew the lines on the ground and established the order that human kings would later be tasked to maintain. A Sumerian text known as the Barton Cylinder describes the city of Nippur not as a human settlement, but as a place established by the Anunnaki as their own terrestrial headquarters, a bond between heaven and earth. The role of these beings was not to be worshipped in distant heavens, but to be physically present, engaging in the pragmatic work of civil engineering. And then, there is the silence. The texts record their functions, their decrees, their assignments. They are the subject of official reports and administrative lists. But their motives, their origins, their ultimate agenda, these are never explained. They are presented as a set of operational facts, a governing body whose existence was simply a given. The scribe feels no need to justify their presence or explain their nature, any more than a modern clerk would feel the need to explain the existence of a board of directors. They are simply the highest authority in the system. The silence surrounding their purpose is one of the most profound gaps in the entire record, a void where the why should be. This division of labor is recorded with a cold, systematic logic. The texts describe a cosmic assembly where the Anunnaki are given their assignments. Enlil is given oversight of the Earth's surface, Enki the domain of the deep waters, Anu the domain of the sky. This is a strategic allocation of resources and command structures. It reads like the minutes of a planning meeting for a vast, complex operation. Their interactions are not the passionate, chaotic squabbles of Greek gods. They are formal, hierarchical, and bound by rules of procedure. They issue decrees. They file reports. They respect spheres of influence. They are the functionaries of a vast cosmic bureaucracy. We stand in the desert at night, the sky a field of cold, distant points of light. For the Sumerian scribe, this was not an empty void. It was a charted space, the upper administrative division of the cosmos with its own assigned governor. The movements of the planets and stars were not just omens to be read. They were the visible workings of a system, the celestial counterpart to the ordered running of the temple and the state on earth. The cosmos was not a mystery to be solved, but a bureaucracy to be understood. The others were not supernatural forces. They were the senior management, and their operational theater was the universe itself. This brings us back to the pre-diluvial kings on the prism: Alulim, Alalangar, Enmen-Luana. The text does not call them human. It simply lists their names and the duration of their function. Their role was to act as the local managers, the designated stewards of the kingship on earth. Their impossibly long reigns are perhaps not a measure of biological life, but a reflection of the timescale on which their superiors operated. They were the first chief executives, their terms of office recorded with the same dispassionate accuracy as the rest of the cosmic ledger. They were not ancestors in a human bloodline. They were the first appointees in a long chain of command. If this is the case, then the king list is not a record of our history. It is the record of an institution we have inherited. It is the story of a system of governance, its celestial origins, its first non-human administrators, and the eventual handover to human stewards. We are a later chapter in a story that began long before us, a story of a franchise that was passed down to our species. The first part of the list is not a mythic prologue. It is the necessary corporate history required to understand the terms of the charter we were given. We are not the authors of this story. We are merely its current custodians. The overwhelming sensation, as one reads these functional descriptions, is one of profound absence. The texts speak of these beings as present, active, and engaged in the direct management of terrestrial affairs. They lay out the grid for a city. They appoint a king. They deliver the tools of civilization. But the archaeologist's trowel uncovers only the works of human hands. The world we can touch is a world from which these original architects have withdrawn. The system they designed is still here, echoing in our laws, our cities, and our concepts of power. But the designers themselves are gone. The final image of this act is one of an empty chair in a great hall, an office of immense power, a position of ultimate authority, but its occupant is no longer visible. The records in the archives describe the founder, detail his initial actions, and log the duration of his term. But the office is now held by others, by his distant successors, who may no longer remember the founder's face or understand the full scope of his original design. The system continues to run. The protocols are still followed. But the memory of the original operators has faded from a documented fact into a quiet and persistent ghost that haunts the very foundations of the machine. We return to the Earth itself. An archaeologist kneels in the clean lines of a trench, cut deep into the mound of a forgotten city. The wall of the trench is a book, its pages the compressed layers of centuries. Here, a dark band of ash and charcoal speaks of a great fire. Lower down, the dense strata of packed mud brick mark the floors of houses, one built upon the other. Each layer is a record, a physical memory of life, of work, of presence. The archaeologist's work is to read this book of dirt, to trace the story written in the soil. But sometimes, the most important part of the story is a page that is missing, or a chapter that has been torn out. The most eloquent layer is the one that contains nothing at all. There are sites where the sequence is broken. Between a layer rich with the pottery and tools of a thriving settlement and another layer much later, showing a new and different culture, there is a third layer. It is a thick, uniform band of sterile silt or wind-blown sand. It contains no hearths, no bones, no tools, no sign of human life. It is a silent interruption in the record, a pause of indeterminate length. A great quietness has settled over the land, erasing the city that was there, and leaving a clean, empty surface upon which a new world would later begin. This sterile layer is not an absence of evidence. It is the evidence of an absence. It is the physical signature of the invisible antagonist, the quiet work of time, or of some other, more active force of erasure. This physical rupture in the earth finds its perfect textual parallel in the king list. The scribe, after recording the final pre-diluvial king, Ubara-Tutu of Shurupak, and tallying the grand total of 241 years, makes a new entry. He does not describe a storm. He does not narrate a tragedy. He records a procedural event with the same administrative finality he has used throughout the document. The stylus presses into the clay, forming the words, "Then the flood swept over." It is a line drawn across the ledger. It is the closing of one account and the end of a fiscal era. The event is not presented as a story, but as a hard reset. It is the textual equivalent of that sterile layer of silt, a clean break that separates the world that was from the world that is. After this entry, there is a silence. The scribe does not elaborate. He offers no cause, no consequence, no lamentation. The flood is not a moral judgment or a divine act of war. It is a boundary condition, an environmental event that rendered the previous operating system obsolete. The silence that follows this line on the clay tablet is immense. It is a gap in the record that is more profound than any number. It is the sound of a world being washed away, leaving behind only this single, cold, administrative note. The entire archive of that first epoch, the 241 years of history, is gone. All that is left is this one document, the index to a library that has been drowned. The antagonist is not the water. It is the perfect, implacable silence it left behind. When the record resumes, something has fundamentally changed. The scribe writes, "After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven a second time, the kingship was in Kish. The system has been rebooted. The franchise of governance has been reissued from the same celestial source, but the parameters have been altered. The world after the flood is a different world, operating on a diminished scale. The very nature of time, as recorded in the reigns of its rulers, appears to have been recalibrated. The first epoch is over. The second has begun, but it carries the scar of the great rupture. The first king of this new era is Jushur of Kish. His reign is recorded as 200 years. The number is still vast by our standards, but it is a radical departure from the geological timescales of the pre-diluvial world. The next king, Kula-Sina-Bel, rules for 960 years. Then comes a succession of rulers with reigns measured in hundreds of years, not tens of thousands. The numbers are stepping down, descending from a cosmic scale towards a recognizable, almost human dimension. The scribe records this data with the same methodical precision. He is not noting a decline. He is logging the output of a new system, one that measures power and time in smaller, more constrained units. The world has been shrunk. What was lost in this transition was more than just time. It was a quality of existence. The pre-diluvial record speaks of the Apkallu, the sages who advised the first kings, who brought the foundational knowledge. In the post-diluvial world, these figures are gone. Humanity is now in charge of the system they inherited. The technical support has been withdrawn. The new kings of Kish and Uruk are left to manage the franchise on their own, guided by the memory of a lost greatness and the surviving fragments of its operational manual. The silence in the text is not just about the flood. It is about the withdrawal of the founders, the departure of the original architects, leaving their successors to run a machine they did not build and may no longer fully understand. The archaeologist's trowel confirms this break. In the ruins of Ur and other ancient cities, there is a visible flood stratum. Below this thick layer of water-laid clay, we find the remains of one culture. Above it, after a period of abandonment, a new culture emerges. The pottery styles are different. The architectural methods have changed. The very layout of the city is altered. The physical record on the ground tells the same story as the textual record on the prism. There was a world before and a world after, and they are separated by a profound and catastrophic discontinuity. The silence in the archaeological record is the space between two worlds. This persistent absence of explanation is the most unsettling feature of the document. The scribe, who so carefully recorded the names and numbers, feels no need to explain why the world was broken. He does not question the recalibration of time. He simply accepts it as the new operational parameter. His silence is not a sign of ignorance, but of a different kind of knowledge. For him, the flood was not a mystery to be solved. It was a known event, a fixed point in the timeline, a fundamental feature of his civilization's memory of itself. The mystery is not his, it is ours. We are the ones who have forgotten what this silence means. This silence is not empty. It is a presence. It is the defining feature of the historical landscape we have inherited. It is a wall that stands at the very beginning of our own story, and on the other side of that wall is a world we can only glimpse through the cold, strange data of this one surviving list. The silence is the antagonist's greatest victory, a perfect act of erasure that has left us with a history that begins in the middle of the story. The first chapter is missing, and the silence is the shape of the hole where it used to be. For a moment in the place where you are, try to perceive a similar interval. Listen not to the sounds around you, but to the quiet space that holds them. The pause between breaths, the gap between the ticking of a clock, the stillness that falls after a door has closed. That interval is a form of silence, a small piece of the great absence that structures our own perception of time. If you feel so moved, you might record the nature of that silence in the space below. A single word describing the quiet you observed. A small act of witness to the presence of an interval. A quiet acknowledgement of the antagonist who works in the spaces between. The king list is not the only record to preserve the memory of this rupture. The same story, fragmented and personalized, appears in other texts. A Sumerian account speaks of a pious king named Ziusudra, who is warned of the coming flood and builds a great boat to survive. The later Akkadian epics of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh tell a similar tale of a chosen man who preserves the seed of life through a world-destroying deluge. These are often read as myths, but when placed alongside the king list, they feel like something else: survivor accounts. They are the human, narrative counterparts to the cold, administrative report of a system-wide catastrophe. The silence of the list is the official story. These are the testimonials of the witnesses. The true scale of the loss is unimaginable. The king list is an index, a table of contents. What was the library it referred to? What were the historical, scientific, and philosophical records of a civilization that measured its own existence in quarter-million-year epochs? The flood did not just destroy cities. It destroyed an archive. It wiped a hard drive containing the knowledge of a world that operated on principles we can no longer comprehend. All we have is the file directory. The silence is the sound of that erased knowledge, the ghost of a library that now contains only a single enigmatic book. The antagonist, then, is not an event, but a process. It is a force of systemic forgetting. It is the power that draws a clean line between one age and the next, ensuring that the memory of the former world survives only in a carefully curated, almost incomprehensible format. The purpose of this erasure seems to have been to create a new beginning, a new set of rules. The silence is a firewall, a security measure to prevent the old data from corrupting the new system. It is not an accident of history. It is a feature of the design. The world after the flood is a world haunted by echoes. The new kings build ziggurats, great artificial mountains, reaching for a heaven that now seems more distant. They perform the rituals, they maintain the temples, they consult the omens, all in an attempt to manage the system they have been left with. But the connection to the original source has become attenuated. They are living in the shadow of a far greater and now inaccessible age. The silence between the layers is not just in the past, it is a constant presence, a reminder of a lost connection, a power that has been withdrawn. We return to the object, the clay prism turning slowly in the low light. We can see the physical marks, the wedge for flood, the space that follows it. It is a scar in the clay, a visible seam where two realities were stitched together. The scribe's hand paused here. He lifted his stylus, repositioned it, and began a new section. That brief physical pause, that moment of transition 4,000 years ago, is the epicenter of the entire mystery. It is the point where the silence was made permanent, where the forgetting was codified and entered into the official record. This silence is not a failure of the record. It is the record's most important message. It tells us that history is not a continuous, unbroken line. It is a fragmented text, with entire volumes missing. The King List does not tell us the story of a lost world. It tells us that a world was lost. The silence is the proof. It is a deliberate and structured void, and its presence suggests that the map of our past is far stranger and more broken than we have ever allowed ourselves to imagine. The space between the words is where the real story resides, waiting not for a translator, but for a listener patient enough to hear the sound of nothing at all. We have followed the threads of evidence from the baked clay of Sumer to the brittle papyrus of Egypt. We have seen the same pattern emerge from the dust of two separate worlds, a history that begins before history, an epoch of impossible duration ruled by beings who were not us. These are not scattered myths, born of campfire tales. They are administrative records, preserved in the archives of the world's first states, copied with the cold precision of a legal clerk. The consistency is the first signal, the echo that refuses to fade. It suggests we are not looking at multiple independent stories, but at multiple independent witnesses testifying to a single, coherent memory. A memory of a time when the world was structured differently, a memory so fundamental that it had to be preserved, even when it no longer made sense. The true strangeness is not in the content, but in the form. These records do not speak the language of wonder. They speak the language of bureaucracy. They are lists, ledgers, and chronological reports. This is the language of a system, a structured and repeatable method for organizing information. Why would civilizations separated by time and geography both adopt such a specific and peculiar administrative format for their foundational history? It implies a common source, not for a story, but for a protocol. It suggests that the first scribes of both Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley were working from a shared template, a standardized operating procedure for how the deep past was to be officially documented. The mystery, then, is not just the information, but the origin of the information management system itself. This shared protocol points directly back to the function of the others: the Apkallu, the Shemsu Hor, the Anunnaki. They are remembered not as gods who demanded worship, but as instructors who delivered a curriculum. They brought the software of civilization: law, astronomy, architecture, agriculture. Their presence in the records is defined by their function. They were the original administrators, the technical consultants who oversaw the establishment of a new terrestrial order. The standardized format of the king lists, then, might be seen as a product of their work, the official documentation for the system they themselves installed. It is the user manual, left behind by the original programmers, explaining the history of the software and its celestial origins before the handover to human operators. If we accept this framing, for a moment, the implication is profound. The rise of civilization was not a slow, uncertain process of human discovery. It was a project, an implementation, a deliberate transfer of a complete pre-packaged system of urban living onto the human platform. The sudden appearance of complex societies in the archaeological record is no longer a puzzle. It is the sign of a successful installation. We did not invent this world of cities, laws, and hierarchies. We inherited it. We were chosen as its stewards. The history recorded on the prism is not our story of creation, but the story of our appointment, the official record of the moment our species was given the keys to a machine far older and more complex than itself. We are standing on the wind-swept ground of Eridu, the place the texts call the first station of kingship. There is nothing here now but dust and the silence of millennia. But the grid of the original city is still faintly visible, a ghost in the soil. Here, the first canal was dug, the first temple foundation was laid, the first record was kept. The air is thin, the silence absolute. It is a silence that invites contemplation, not of what is here, but of what is absent. The presence of the instructors is gone. The memory of the transfer is reduced to a few lines of cuneiform. We are left only with the system itself, the vast, intricate machine of civilization that continues to run, and the unsettling feeling that we have long forgotten its original purpose. At the center of this inherited memory is a catastrophic failure, a system crash, the flood. In the cold, administrative language of the king list, it is the event that draws a hard line between two epochs. It is the moment the original operating system was wiped clean. It is not a story of divine anger. It is a report of a procedural reset. The world before this event, the world of the designers and the 10,000-year reigns, was rendered inaccessible. The rupture is total. The silence it creates is not an absence of sound, but an absence of data, a firewall erected between one version of reality and the next. This was not just a great flood, it was a great forgetting. And our world, our history, is what comes after. The second descent of kingship, the new beginning in the city of Kish. But it is a diminished world. The reigns of kings, once measured in geological time, are now counted in centuries, and soon in mere decades. The direct connection to the founders is severed. The instructors have withdrawn. Humanity is left in charge of the rebooted system, working from fragmented memories and incomplete manuals. Our recorded history is not the story of a beginning, but the story of a recovery. We are the survivors of a cataclysm we can no longer remember, attempting to rebuild a world whose original blueprints have been lost forever. This suggests the silence, the erasure, was not an accident of time. It was a feature of the transition. The Great Forgetting was a necessary component of the new system. We were meant to begin again, unburdened by the memory of the previous world and its incomprehensible timescale. The fragmentation of the records, the reduction of the deep past into a sterile list of numbers, was a form of curation. It preserved the fact that a prior age existed, but it stripped away the context, the meaning, and the operational knowledge of that world. The silence is not a void. It is a carefully constructed boundary, designed to keep us within the parameters of our new, more limited reality. What does it mean to live inside a system whose foundational chapter has been deliberately erased? It means that our understanding of ourselves is incomplete. Our search for origins is a search within a library from which the first volume has been removed. We can study the remaining books with infinite care. We can analyze every word and every sentence, but we will never understand the full story, because the premise, the author's original intent, is missing. The foundation of our world is not a solid truth, but a profound and structured absence. We are a civilization with amnesia, and the king list is a single, haunting note, written to remind us that there is something we were made to forget. The prism, then, is transformed. It is no longer just a list of kings. It is a boundary marker. It is a piece of evidence from the other side of the firewall. Its true purpose was not to record a history, but to mark the existence of a history that is no longer accessible. It is the sole surviving page from the lost first volume. Its cold, mathematical language, its impossible numbers, its alien administrative tone, these are not failures of historical storytelling. They are the authentic voice of a different order of reality. It is a message from a world that did not operate by our rules, a world that measured its existence on a different clock. The prism is a tombstone for a dead conception of time itself. To continue this vigil is to accept that the most important records may be the ones that are missing. The path forward is not toward a single revelation, but a deeper form of listening, and attention to the silences that structure the story. This inquiry is not for those who seek easy answers, but for those who can inhabit the quiet of the archive and feel the weight of what is not there. Those who choose to remain know that the most profound questions are the ones that must be returned to again and again, allowing the mystery to deepen with each visit. If these records are even a faint echo of a real history, then the entire timeline of human progress is a fiction. The dawn of civilization was not a dawn at all. It was a noon, resuming after a long and terrible night. We are not the inventors of this way of life. We are not the first to build cities, to write laws, to map the heavens. We are the inheritors, the successors, a second attempt. We are a later chapter in a story that is vastly older and stranger than we know, and our entire world is built upon the ruins of the one that came before. The ground beneath our feet is not virgin soil. It is the sediment of a drowned and forgotten age. We pull back, away from the dust of Iraq and the quiet of the museum, to see the earth itself, turning in the blackness. A sphere of blue and white, silent and beautiful. Our cities are a faint web of light on its surface, a fragile network of human order. We see this as the entirety of the story, the pinnacle of the planet's long journey toward intelligence. But the King List suggests this is a profound error of perspective. It hints that this is merely the current configuration. It suggests that another, older network of order once existed on this same sphere, a system that lasted for 250,000 years before it was washed away. Our civilization is a fleeting light in a darkness that is filled with the ghosts of a much greater and now extinguished fire. The others, the architects of that first fire, remain defined only by their function. They were not gods to be worshipped, but engineers to be observed. They built the framework. They managed the initial long phase of its operation. They oversaw its catastrophic failure and reboot. And then they withdrew. Their motives, their nature, their ultimate purpose, These are the great unknowns, the variables for which we have no data. They are a presence defined entirely by the structure they left behind and the profound silence that followed their departure. They are the invisible authors of a book we are still living in, and whose first chapter we are no longer permitted to read. This leads to the final, unsettling implication. The system they designed did not vanish. It was rebooted, recalibrated, and handed over. We are still living within its architecture. The principles of hierarchical power, of centralized authority, of a kingship that seems to flow from an unseen source. These are the foundational protocols of our world. The machine they built is still running. We have personalized it. We have adapted it. We have forgotten its origins, but we have never truly escaped it. We are the unknowing custodians of a legacy system, performing rituals and following procedures whose original purpose has been lost in the silence on the other side of the flood. The question, then, is no longer whether Alulim ruled for 800 years. That is a question about the past. The implication of the king list is a question about the present. What is the nature of the world we actually inhabit? Are we the masters of our own civilization, or are we merely the current users of an ancient and inherited technology, a system of order whose terms of service were written in a language we have forgotten, for a purpose we may not wish to understand? The prism does not offer an answer. It simply reminds us that the question must be asked. It shifts the ground beneath our feet, suggesting that the mystery is not buried in the dust of the past, but is alive in the very structure of the world around us. The journey ends where it began, in the dark. The low hum of the climate control is the only sound, a steady note holding back the tide of decay. A single, focused light illuminates the glass case, and within it, the clay prism. It does not offer up any more of its secrets. It has said all that it will say. The wedge-shaped marks, so precise and so alien, hold their silence. After the long recitation of its contents, after the journey across millennia and continents, the object has returned to its primary state, an enigma of baked earth, a piece of administrative hardware from a world that has dissolved. It sits in the conditioned air, a quiet monument not to a history that was recorded, but to a history that was erased. The space around it is heavy with the weight of that which it does not say, the vast library of a lost time for which this prism is the only surviving catalog entry. We have followed the scribe's hand, tracing a line from a world we recognize into one we cannot comprehend. We have stood in the silent archives of other civilizations and heard the faint echo of the same impossible memory. The pattern has been established, the contradiction laid bare. But here, at the end of the inquiry, there is no sense of solution. There is only a deepening of the question, a quiet expansion of the mystery until it fills the room, until it becomes the very atmosphere we are breathing. The search for an answer has led not to a destination, but to a vantage point, a place from which we can see the true scale of the abyss that separates our small, known history from the vast, dark continent of a past that lies on the other side of a great and deliberate forgetting. The prism is a bridge across that abyss, but it is a bridge that stops in the middle of the chasm. Look closely at the surface of the clay, at the texture of the material itself. It is earth. It is the dust of the river plains, mixed with water, shaped by a human hand, and hardened by fire. It is the most solid and tangible of things. And yet the information it carries seems to speak of a reality as intangible as a dream, a world of time stretched thin, of power that operated on a cosmic scale. This is the final, irreducible paradox of the object. It is a piece of the ground beneath our feet that testifies to a history that seems to have no grounding in any world we know. To hold it in your mind is to hold two irreconcilable ideas at once: the undeniable reality of the artifact and the impossible reality of the world it describes. It does not ask for belief. It simply is. and its existence is a quiet and persistent disruption of our own certainty. The scribe who made these marks is long gone. His world has turned to dust around the object he created to defy that very dust. We cannot know what he thought as he pressed his stylus into the clay, whether he felt the strangeness of the numbers he was tasked to record, or if for him a 800-year reign was a simple and accepted fact, a piece of data as mundane as the price of barley. Perhaps the mystery is not in the text, but in our distance from it. We have lost the context, the frame of reference in which this information was once coherent. We are reading a single page, torn from a book whose language we have forgotten, and we are mistaking the grammar of a lost world for a collection of impossible tales. The silence of the scribe is the silence of a world view that has passed so completely from the earth that we can no longer think its thoughts. We leave the quiet of the museum, and the scene dissolves. The air grows warm and dry. We are standing in the desert of southern Iraq, under a sky that is turning a deep, bruised purple as the sun bleeds away below the horizon. Before us is a low, indistinct mound, the tell that marks the grave of Eridu, the place the list calls the first city. The wind moves in a low whisper across the sand, carrying with it the dust of millennia. There is nothing here but absence, nothing but the immense, crushing silence of a place that was once the center of a world. This is the source. The data on the prism, now resting under glass 1,000 miles away, was born of this ground. Here, the silence is not an idea. It is a physical presence. It is the final state of all empires. The first stars begin to appear, cold and sharp in the clear desert air. For the people who lived here, this was not a random scattering of lights. It was a map, a clock, a scripture. It was the upper world, the celestial sphere from which the principle of order had descended. The sky was not a void. It was the other half of their reality, a place of structure and power that mirrored and informed the structure of their lives on the plains below. To stand here, between the dust of the first city and the eternal patterns of the stars, is to feel the full scale of the worldview that created the king list. It was a world that saw no division between the administrative and the cosmic, a world in which a king's reign could be a function of a celestial cycle, and a transfer of power on earth could be a reflection of a transaction in the heavens. The document we have examined has not provided us with a new history. Instead, it has demonstrated that our own history is incomplete, that it begins on the second page of a much longer book. The king list is not a narrative to be understood, but a condition to be acknowledged. It is the evidence of a rupture. It tells us that a world existed, that it operated on a timescale that is now alien to us, and that it was brought to a sudden and catastrophic end. It does not explain what that world was or why it was destroyed. It simply records, with cold administrative finality, that the event occurred. Its purpose is not to fill a gap in our knowledge, but to draw our attention to the existence and the profound nature of the gap itself. The story is the hole in the story. This absence is the true protagonist of our inquiry. It is the silent, invisible force that shapes the entire narrative. It is the lost knowledge of the pre-diluvial world. It is the withdrawn presence of the original architects. It is the great forgetting that was codified by the flood. We have spent this time together walking the perimeter of that absence, mapping its edges, feeling its immense gravity. But we cannot enter it. The records that might have illuminated that lost epoch are gone, drowned in a catastrophe that was both physical and informational. We are left on the shore of our own small historical island, looking out across a vast ocean of time, with only this one strange message in a bottle to tell us that another continent once existed on the far side. So we return to the central, quiet fact. A civilization of profound practicality, a people who invented accounting and bureaucracy, chose to anchor their entire history in a sequence of data that defies all practical reality. They did not relegate this story to the realm of myth. They inscribed it in their most formal, most permanent records of state. For them, the 241-200-year reign of the first kings was not a fantasy. It was the foundational truth upon which their own world was built. It was their period one. Our inability to accept this fact is our problem, not theirs. It is a measure of the distance we have traveled from their way of seeing, a sign of the profound amnesia that separates our age from theirs. The paradox is not in the prism, it is in us. The light in the museum archive continues to dim. The single beam that illuminated the prism softens, its edges blurring, until the object is little more than a dark shape against a darker background. The hum of the climate control seems to fade, not into silence, but into a deeper frequency. The sound of time itself, passing in the dark. We have been granted a period of observation, a quiet vigil with a messenger from a drowned world. Now that time is ending. The curator is receding, their voice fading, leaving us alone with the object and the echo of the questions it has raised. The archive is returning to its slumber, its secrets once again locked away in the quiet and the dark, waiting for the next visitor who is patient enough to listen. There is a feeling in the end, not of having been taught something, but of having remembered it. A faint and distant recognition, a sense of a story that was already known, deep within the oldest parts of the mind. The King List does not feel like a discovery. It feels like a confirmation of a suspicion we have always held, that our world is not the first, that our history is not the whole story, and that our civilization is built upon the foundations of a far stranger and more ancient structure. The prism is a catalyst, an object that, when held in the mind, awakens a dormant memory of a time when the earth was different, when the sky was closer, and when the nature of power was something other than human. What remains is not an answer, but a resonance. It is the vibration left in the air after a great bell has been struck. The sound itself is gone, but the feeling of it continues, a subtle pressure against the senses. The story of the pre-diluvial kings and the Great Rupture is not a puzzle to be solved and put away. It is a thought to be lived with. It is a quiet and permanent alteration of perspective. It changes the way one looks at a ruin, at a starry sky, at the very ground beneath one's feet. It suggests that the world is older, stranger, and more deeply layered than we have allowed ourselves to believe, and that the most profound histories are the ones that are told in silence. The final image holds, the silhouette of the prism in the deep gloom of the archive. It is a shape, a presence, a question mark made of clay. It is a key for which we have no lock. It is a single, coherent piece of information from a system that is no longer running. The darkness around it is not empty. It is the space of our own incomprehension. For a long and unbroken moment, there is no movement, no sound, no voice. There is only this object, this memory of an impossible time, resting in its perfect and profound silence, waiting. The screen holds on this image, the darkness slowly deepening until the silhouette itself is absorbed. The last thing to fade is the faint reflection of the archival light on the surface of the glass case, a final distant point of light in an encroaching void. Then it too is gone. The hum fades completely. The narrative does not end. It simply stops. And in the quiet that follows, in the space left behind, the real work of contemplation begins. The question remains, now heavier, now more resonant, now a permanent part of the silence that it has created.